you, Sam, and thanks to everybody who's joining us today. I am joining you from Yagara Yagarapul and Turrbal country, which is west of Brisbane, and I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners on the lands that I'm joining you from today, and of course the traditional owners, the First Nations people and custodians of all the land on which glossies are found, as we affectionately call them, glossies, and just respect the fact that country was never ceded. And love it if you can put where you're from in the chat too, and say g'day. We know these amazing species that we're talking about today occurs over so much of Eastern Australia, so it'd be good to see who's here today. Okay, so, and I'd also like to sort of acknowledge the Glossy Black Conservancy, Shannon Mooney, who's on the line with me as well, and I have been working on this mapping for glossies with support from WIRES, the Pat Connor Aviation Award, and also, the Conservancy. We've both been involved in there. We have a long history, I guess, with Glossy Black-Cockatoos and also habitat mapping, and I'll go through some of that with you today. A little bit of background to the history about what it is that we've been working on, where we're taking it, what it can be used for, and some of the challenges and opportunities that the habitat mapping provides for us. So with no more ado, I will move on. So a little bit of background. So back in 2016, Shannon and I worked with a different organisation called SEQ Catchments, and we developed habitat mapping in partnership with the Conservancy to map the occurrence or habitat for Glossy Black-Cockatoos across Southeast Queensland bioregion, which is, and only the Queensland section. So even though it's called the Southeast Queensland bioregion, it does extend into northern New South Wales. However, our mapping is actually limited only to the Queensland section of that. And in 2016, that mapping was supported by the Conservancy and the Australian government. We know that glossies are under threat. We're a vulnerable species. There's a population size of estimated about 7,500 birds, which is decreasing. The area of occupancy is decreasing. Glossies were recently, or relatively recently, only 3 years ago, listed as nationally vulnerable, and prior to that were listed as vulnerable or threatened in every state that they occur. But the Conservancy has been leading an enormous amount of data collection in the last 10 years through some citizen science projects, like Sam mentioned to those of you who were online a little earlier. There's the Great Glossy Count that we partnered with BirdLife to develop some modules on, but it initiated with the Conservancy probably well over a decade ago now, doing annual and then biannual now counts of populations of glossies. So got an enormous amount of citizen science data collected about the birds, their feed trees, a little less about their nesting sites, but we're pooling all of that information together. And of course, there was a lot of research that's been done in the last 10 years to improve our understanding of glossies. Some work that Steve Garnett and colleagues did released just recently shows that glossies are actually facing the most threats of any of the threatened bird species in Australia. So all of these are really good reasons why we approached WIRES and took advantage of their opportunity of their grant funding and applied for some funding to update this mapping, given that it's 10 years old. Some of the features of that mapping, it's based on high precision citizen science data. So what we mean by high precision is it's limited by date back to as far as about 1990. And it's limited in terms of precision, location precision. So it has to be data that's 500 meters or less in terms of its accuracy on its location. So none of this, we saw birds, they were flying, they were 2 kilometers away business. It has to be really precise data on the birds, but also their feed tree records. So where we found evidence or orts of where the birds are feeding. And I'll just give I've prepared this presentation with maybe only a few assumptions about people's knowledge on glossies. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about glossies and a little bit about the mapping, and hopefully bring everyone to the same sort of rough level. But if you need more information on anything, please feel free to put it in the chat. So once we pulled all that data, I think Shannon, you call it often a data trawl. We did a trawl, try and scoop up as much information on the birds and their feed trees as we could. We use that to intersect on regional ecosystems. We are really fortunate in Queensland to have one of the best vegetation mapping systems, not perfect, but best systems in Australia, and that's called our regional ecosystem mapping. That's updated by the Queensland Herbarium and used by the state government in a lot of its planning processes. So we intersected sightings with regional ecosystems, came up with a list Then we talked to our experts, members of the Conservancy and other researchers, and said, what does this look like? From that, we identified core habitats and non-core habitats, and there's some important distinctions on those that I'll get into in a minute. We also looked at the confidence based on proximity to records. So because we were identifying regional ecosystems, we've got a regional ecosystem with a record of a bird feeding in it or using it, well, that's known use of habitat. If we have exactly the same forest, but it's a bit further away, how much further away would it need to be before you start losing confidence on evidence of use? So, and we know glossies are really mobile birds, so we knew that they could travel. So as you'll see in that table that's presented to you on the slide there, we have our confidence rules, which were based on proximity to a known sighting. So as if we got further away, so that the least confidence is those that are more than, say, 15 kilometres away from a record, because we know glossies travel big distances. So that's the general concept behind the rules about how we identified foraging habitat. And what was defined as core habitat, that's that shaded box on the screen there, and what fell outside of that into non-core habitat. We have limited data on nesting glossies in Southeast Queensland and the bioregion, but what we did have, we were able to buffer that by 1,000 metres and basically say anything and everything that's within 1,000 metres of that known nest site is core habitat. It's really important. So that could be the trees that the birds might be nesting in. It could be trees that they're not nesting in, but could be nesting in, I don't know, in the next decade or so, depending on what hollows they've got. And it could be all the vegetation or lack of vegetation around there that actually makes that suitable for those birds to decide to have nested there. So that's the 1,000 metre buffer. We didn't identify at that point any general habitat, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means because we've looked into that for this next round of mapping. And anything that we identified as core habitat was recommended to the state government for inclusion under the Vegetation Management Act as essential habitat. So all of that core habitat identified in 2016 was approved as essential habitat and is currently actually represented also in the wildlife habitat mapping that is also as identified under matters of state environment significance. The non-core habitat mapping, all of those other layers, which are really useful for targeting our great glossy count surveys or to do more research into understanding what's going on with glossies, we made that available to our glossy partners, conservancy partners, I should say, including local governments and state agencies, as well as community. And all mapping layers are shared with the Conservancy members. So you can see there on the screen, that's what the document looked like. You can find that on ResearchGate and on generally online if you want to have a look at it. And that's the map. So you can see that map shows in those dark purple colours what's considered our essential habitat, known, high confidence. The lighter purple is the areas that we're fairly sure those glossies could be there, but we don't have data to prove that they occur there. And then as we move further out, we've got less confidence in that those green shading on that map. And then the nesting overlay, you can't really see it at that scale, but there are little dots there with little yellow circles around them. So a little bit about how that mapping is being used to support species conservation and recovery in Queensland. As I mentioned, it's the habitat mapping was accepted as matters of state environment significance mapping. We are really fortunate here in Queensland that we have an accepted model and process from the Queensland government from how wildlife habitat can be mapped and can be or has the potential to be used as a matter of state environment significance, which means it has to be then referred to in decisions on land use change and planning decisions. There's a mandate that all MSES, that's the abbreviation, matters of state environment significance, or MES mapping needs to be and should be included into local government planning. So it sets up species for a better opportunity for conservation than otherwise if their habitat isn't mapped. So there's three preferred options for mapping habitat that are presented to you there in their descending order of priority. So the Queensland government prefers peer or expert reviewed and approved habitat suitability model. That's what we did in 2016, and that's what we're doing right now, updating that as well. They also accept habitat maps that are accepted by the relevant government authority. And this particularly falls when it's outside of that regional ecosystem mapping, environments like our foreshores where we've got turtles nesting or we've got shorebird roosts. So if the marine parks or other agency says, yep, that mapping's good, it can move through into MSES. And when we don't have that level of mapping, the fallback position is species point records buffered to 100 metres. And this is the case for any glossy records that are out in Queensland but are outside the Southeast Queensland bioregion, mapped as buffered points. So they put a 1,000 metre buffer around one of those high precision records. And that's the habitat that they're protecting under MSES. And that's the same with any of the other threatened species as they put that buffered point. So there's not much outside of habitat, not much habitat protected if it's not modelled habitat. So the habitat suitability models, which is what we've developed, identifies the core and the non-core habitats, and both are used in biodiversity planning assessments, aquatic conservation assessments, and the like, but only core habitat is included as an MSES as wildlife habitat or under regulated vegetation mapping as essential habitat. So that's the critical definition between how core and non-core work together in the state system of protection. Currently, there's only about 23 of over 1,300 threatened or near threatened species in Queensland have habitat suitability models. So there's a lot of scope, and that's part of the reason the Conservancy and we were really keen to bring this habitat mapping to Queenslanders and others to be able to say, we can do this for glossies. It doesn't have to be driven, the process doesn't have to be driven by state governments or researchers. It can be driven by community-based organisations using citizen science, consulting with experts to develop some robust models. So we're using glossies, but we're also advocating not just for glossies outside of SEQ bioregion, but we want to do a bit of advocacy for our other threatened species that share their habitats and other areas as well. So yeah, as I mentioned, outside of Southeast Queensland, glossy habitat is just those buffered 1,000 metre buffered points. And that's only used for known nesting, roosting or feeding records, which is appropriate because it's a highly mobile species. So glossies flying over an area won't protect its habitat, but glossies roosting or feeding or nesting, those sighting records can be buffered. So down there, I've also, on the bottom of the slide, the bottom left there, there's a definition of what is core habitat and what is non-core habitat. And those are the definitions that we're working to in revising this update of the 2016 mapping. Those definitions mean that the MSES then goes through and is mapped into, is public available, I should say, under the State Planning Policy Interactive Mapping System. You can jump on there, search for that tool, you will find the mapping that is in the system and look at it. And matters of state environment significance can also overlap under the state planning policy, can overlap with MSES under the offsets regulation, but they're not necessarily identical. So there's a little bit of room to move in terms of those definitions and how they apply in an offset space. And you cannot have state and local environmentally significant matters being over the same thing. And this is an important point, which we'll talk to a little bit later. Also, and particularly because it comes into play, I guess, in terms of offsets, and also there can't be duplication of offsets at national, state or local level. And ideally, we don't really want to be offsetting anyway, do we? We just want to be protecting habitat. So let's get a plug in for that first. I don't know why I've got a red mark on my screen. Anyway, so I just put down in the bottom right there, that mixed method habitat suitability modelling. You can search for that. You will find it online as a resource if you are interested in doing habitat mapping modelling for threatened species in Queensland. Please have a look at that and consider how you could potentially make that one happen. Oops. Sorry, I'm trying to work out why I've got a red line on my screen. I hope that's not really annoying for you guys. Anyway, we'll move on without it. So, yeah, did the 26, this is the important question for me, did the 2016 mapping reduce habitat loss for glossies? Unfortunately, I'm going to have to say, not entirely sure. We know the work that Shannon's done. We know back in 2016 that we were able to identify, 1.65 million hectares of remnant habitat occurs in the bioregion for remnant habitat for Glossy Black-Cockatoo occurs in the SEQ bioregion. We know that slats clearing polygons tell us that amount of remnant vegetation has reduced by nearly, or 9,680 hectares since we did the mapping, comprising, nearly 2,000 hectares of that was in that core habitat and theoretically, at least, protected under MSES. We also know that nearly 8,000 hectares outside of that in that non-core habitat area has been lost in the last 10 years. And there's 4,377, maybe give or take a little, patches of habitat that were impacted. What that tells us is there's lots of little changes happening across the landscape have added up to that over 9,500 hectares of glossy habitat lost in the bioregion. When I say, did it reduce habitat loss? Without actually understanding what referrals were made and rejected, potentially under the development assessment processes, it's really hard for us to unpack that. But we think that there's been a lot less habitat lost than if it hadn't been mapped. So we might have reduced the amount of habitat loss, but we haven't stopped it. And 9,500 hectares is certainly a worry for glossies in the SEQ. We found that most of the loss seems to have occurred in the northern part of the bioregion, associated with forestry thinning activities and forestry activities and some grazing. We know other losses also occurred and gets mapped under slats. So we know that drought caused some huge losses of feed trees. They were dying even before the 2019-2020 fires took place. The impact of those maps, those fires, was estimated by Churchill et al. Back in 2023 as being over 53,000 hectares of habitat for glossies in Queensland were impacted by the 2019-2020 fires. We also know that in shaping SEQ review that the Conservancy undertook, we identified nearly 19,000 hectares of glossy habitat in the urban footprint, and nearly 4,000 hectares of that is in what's considered rural living area. So there's a lot of habitat still potentially needing our support to protect it, but we do believe that the 2016 mapping did reduce our habitat loss. I've just listed there, thanks to Shannon for this information, some of the activities that caused the greatest loss of glossy black-cockatoo habitat in SEQ bioregion. A lot of that was clearing to pasture. Even simple things like internal property roads and fences and fire breaks have led to a loss of habitat. Forestry seemed to be one that came out quite strongly, where we've had some vegetation removed and crown cover lost, was picked up by the slats work. And also a little bit of cropping and horticulture, infrastructure development, urban development, and some mapping corrections. So there's a whole range of activities that have contributed in a whole range of spaces. As I said, lots of little impacts that have led to that big figure of 9,500 hectares. So just to share with you a couple of maps for those of you who are a bit of a map fanatics like I am. I always like to go, so that sounds really interesting, but where and why and what's happening? And you can see on this map that Shannon prepared, in the red is where the statewide land and tree survey data shows that there has been some form of loss. So that you can see there's lots of patches there in both the northern section of the bioregion, which is shown on the left of your screen, and the right hand the southern part of the bioregion, which is on the right hand side of the screen. The blue is the areas of glossy black habitat that we mapped in 2016 that seem to have been lost since we did that mapping. And the light purple is, again, we've just put up on there the 2016 mapping showing you where the core habitats and the non-core habitats are, being the dark purple being the core habitat for glossy. So you can see, on the left of the screen there, there's some patches there. We seem to have quite a lot of blue in the midst of a patch of dark purple, whereas a lot of the other areas we've really got just scattered clearing activities or loss activities everywhere. So what do glossies need from us? Well, to achieve recovery of a glossy black cockatoo, so we're talking a nationally vulnerable species, we need to prevent the loss of their known and potential foraging habitat and trees. We prevent the loss of their nesting and drinking sites, prevent the loss of hollow-bearing trees that are more than 40 centimetres in diameter at breast height or DBH, and protect regrowth and recovering habitats to remnant status. If we've got a nationally threatened species, nationally vulnerable species, and it's considered to still be declining, then we need to be providing it with more habitat, not taking away habitat. We need to be allowing for population recovery. Don't seem to be currently doing that particularly well. And we're hoping that with this revisit to the mapping, working with our expert panel, bringing together again the critical science and data that's been provided by our researchers and our citizen sciences to say again to governments, this is a nationally vulnerable species. We need to be saying no a little bit more to clearing of habitat, and we need to be putting more effort into conserving, protecting, restoring, regenerating habitats. Otherwise, we will not get population recovery. Some thoughts there from me, which is, those of you who are joining us online who've been involved in revegetation and restoration projects would probably know that $10,000 a hectare isn't very much to be putting in for trying to replant a forest, particularly an ecosystem rather than a food plantation, for example. But if we just did that at $10,000 a hectare to replant and try and restore that 9,680 hectares of habitat, will cost us $968 million without considering maintenance, without considering the fact that it would take those trees at least 10 years, feed trees, to grow and provide reasonable amount of food for our glossies. If we're growing trees to 40 centimetres DBH to provide nesting habitat, that's going to take decades, let alone the preference is for larger trees. So again, that could take hundreds of years. So to turn around recovery isn't a quick fix. We're talking 10 years for food, and we're talking decades, 50, 100 years for a nest tree. Losing them has a big impact. We also know that whilst glossies will feed in trees that are planted, isolated trees in parks, we've seen them feed in trees that are in nature strips on highways. So they'll feed on planted she oaks, but we don't have any evidence at the moment of artificial nest hollows being used by wild glossies on the mainland. We're trying to learn as much as we can about what the kangaroo island birds are doing, because they seem to have adapted quite well to using nest hollows. But those artificial nest hollows, those designs and other designs where they've been trialled on mainland Australia, haven't had any evidence of their use. If you do know of a design that works, love to hear about it, please. Please message us, put something in the chat, and we can get in touch with you, because we'd love to know more. And I think we were talking the other day in the Research and Science Working Group about trying to do a little bit more of a consolidated research on where people are trialling those. So again, if you're trialling them, please let us know, pop something in the chat. So the 2025 mapping update that we're putting together, we're using that new data, new high precision feed tree records, nest records, and bird records. So first thing was pulling all that together. We've talked to BirdLife, we've got BirdLife's data, we've got information from eBird, we've trawled iNaturalist for records of orts and feed trees, as well as of the birds. And we've talked to the Queensland government and got access to all of their mapping from WildNet, data from WildNet as well. So we pulled as much information as together. Oh, and of course, our local government partners, some of whom have their own separate databases, we've been able to get information from them as well. So a huge number of data sets to work through and crunch together and to do this mapping. When we've applied that, we've been able to, and also based on, the research that our experts and others have done, we've added 4 feed tree species based on research and the community decisions to the habitat mapping. So we now have just counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 species identified as their preferred. We added Alocasuarina lumini and Alocasuarina rigida based on those community and research observations of use. We've also added, for the first time, Casuarina cunninghamiana and Casuarina glauca. They're not used intensively, they're used occasionally, but they seem to be a really important food reserve following during times of food shortages. There were lots of records of birds being sighted in feeding in those trees following the drought, or during the drought in ended in 2019, and after the 2019-2020 fires. We had glossies popping up in locations that they hadn't been seen for decades, and using tree species that they hadn't been sighted using. Based on those new feed tree additions, based on intersect of those feed tree records with regional ecosystem mapping, we've now got a list of about 155 regional ecosystems that we know or think that glossies will use. That's and also that's based by looking for presence of those species within the regional ecosystem description database, that's REDD, that's there, and the technical descriptions of our regional ecosystems, which isn't a comprehensive resource for trying to find where Alocasuarinas and Casuarinas that glossies use, which ecosystems they occur in. Because those species are generally a subcanopy species, they're often not mentioned in the regional ecosystem description database. You don't know until you go and visit it that there's Casuarinas in the subcanopy. But the technical descriptions do give us that information, but we unfortunately don't have those for every regional ecosystem in Queensland or even Southeast Queensland yet. So we pulled together the information that we could, and based on that, we were able to identify regional ecosystems. And we're going through the process of getting our experts to have a look at that mapping, and so look at the regional ecosystems and give us that, does that make sense to them based on their understanding of the species. Other additions we've done, we've added regrowth. As I mentioned before, trees from about 10 years old can provide food for glossies. They're actually known to feed in trees as young as 5 years, but that's probably not a really good resource for them. Our experts decided on 10 years. So we want to add regrowth into the story for glossies. They were mentioned in the 2016 mapping as it's really important to apply the precautionary principle to our regrowth habitats. Now we're trying to take it a step further and just go, if it's 10 years or old, regrowth glossies could, and it's got those she oaks in it that are that age, then glossies could feed on it. It could be an important resource. And it's essential for our population recovery, as I mentioned before. The remnant habitat, as it stands, is still allowing population decline. So we need that regrowth to provide more food habitats. We're accessing the Queensland Herbarium's high value regrowth mapping to do that. That is actually only 15 years and greater, so there's a little bit of a gap. But the Queensland government has, in developing that high value regrowth layer, done an awful lot of vetting and verification and QA on the data to create that layer, so it's robust. We can trust it. It's being used already in state government planning and assessment processes. So we're using that, even though ideally we'd like to go a little bit younger. We've added that general habitat layer that I mentioned before, which is basically remnant vegetation with those occasional feed trees like the Casuarina cunninghamiana and Casuarina glauca that I mentioned before. We're adding a waterhole layer. Our citizen scientists and researchers have confirmed how important a few of the waterholes that we know about in Southeast Queensland are to our glossies. We know that they're particularly important when birds are breeding, when you've got a male bird supporting a female in the hole, sitting on eggs or feeding young. He does all the foraging, brings food back to her. But being a seed-eating bird, they need their water. So those water holes are extremely important during breeding, but important and essential as a seed-eating bird anyway. And I mentioned before, we revised the DBH from trees for nest trees down from 0.7 meters to down to 0.4 meters because there is evidence of glossies nesting in trees of that DBH, and we're trying to protect as much nesting habitat, nest trees as possible. It's likely our confidence rules will remain the same. As I said, we're just waiting, getting the experts to sign off on mapping. It's just gone out to them for some review. And core habitat is likely to be determined in the same definitions as I presented to you earlier. And we just wanted to give an example here. So there's pictures on the screen. So the top right is Alocasarina lumini, which is the bull oak that we find out, particularly out west, and that glossies do use in western parts of SEQ. And down the bottom right, that's some of the she oak cones from Alocasarina rigida, which was an important addition, but we actually found that it co-occurs with other Alocasarinas. So we didn't actually pick up any new regional ecosystems with the addition of that species. It just meant that there's multiple species in those REs that provide food for glossies. An example there on the bottom left and is some mapping. This shows just an extract from the Logan mapping. You can see, compare and contrast, I guess, the difference between the 2015 mapping of glossy habitat and records. You can see those tiny little yellow dots of glossy records, and contrast that with what we're looking at. The draft mapping is showing now for 2025. So we can see that citizen science data has added habitats into there that were potential habitats, have turned into known habitats. And we can also see on there, there's been a lot more data collected over the last 10 years. So really critical information that's come in to support our habitat mapping. So this is the draft and what it's looking like. If we have the same confidence rules that we used last time, this is the dark purple areas shown on that will be probably what's recommended to be core habitats for remnant vegetation. And we're looking at the essential habitat known regrowth in the pink colors in there, which is probably a little bit hard, but you can see that there are some areas picked up around the screen. If you look really, you probably do what I'm doing, just, go right into the screen. Our intent is to finish this mapping in November. Our grant acquittal to WIRES, and thank you again, WIRES, is due in early December. So we finish the mapping in November and we will submit that to the Queensland government for consideration as a matter of state environment significance. There's no guarantees that they'll approve the mapping, but we hope this is an update to mapping that's already in the system, and it should hopefully just go through the process of review and approval. It is only those core habitats, that's that EHK high, as identified there in that dark purple or the bright pink, that will go through, core habitat will go through as MSES. And our intent is also to make the mapping available to others that want to use it. The interesting thing with MSES is, it's only the core habitats that are mapped, but we can't have overlap, or matters of state environment significance cannot be substantially the same as matters of local environment significance. So it falls outside of the state significance mapping. A local government can't, for example, then go, oh, well, the state's just picked up this, I'll pick up all of this and we'll put that as a matter of local environment significance under our planning scheme. That's ineligible because it's talking about the same substantive matter, which is glossy black-cockatoo habitat. However, we had a great discussion with local governments the other day, just last week, about other opportunities and other values that glossy habitats have. So they don't just provide foraging for glossy black-cockatoo. These she oak forests provide enormous resources for many other insectivorous birds, nectivorous birds, species that feed on mistletoes, for example. There's lots of mistletoes, about 5 or 6 species at least, in a couple of species of she oak support 5 or 6 species of mistletoe, which are obviously really important for mistletoe birds, as well as lots of other nectar feeding birds. The litter underneath she oak trees is really important for protecting the ground and providing habitat for some of our native marsupial mice that burrow into that litter, as well as reptiles and other things. Great pollen source as well. So there's lots of other reasons for protecting she oak forests. Another one that actually is identified in the the key threatening process plan for noisy miners. I know they've been listed as a national threatening process because noisy miners can exclude other birds from ecosystems, usually due to things that we've done to those ecosystems. But anyway, but forests that have she oaks are likely to have more noisy miners and likely to support a greater diversity of fantails and whistlers and georgines and flycatchers and all those other species of birds, as well as other species in them. So they're important not just for glossies, the she oak forests are important for a whole range of species. And of course, they're nesting trees. Beautiful big blue gums and other eucalypts and corymbias that support hollows for glossies are obviously used by a substantial number of other hollow dependent species, owls and other birds, as well as snakes and a few other things. So in terms of what can we do about mapping glossy habitats, we've mapped them inside SEQ. There's challenges. It's not a perfect system, but we believe it's better to have, glossies are better off with habitat mapping than they are without. And that would be the same with a lot of other threatened species as well. So we're mapping the habitats, revisiting the mapping inside Southeast Queensland bioregion Queensland section. But that process could easily, or relatively easily, I shouldn't say easy, should I, Shannon? It took us 3 years the first time with glossies. It's such a complex species in their habitat use. But outside of the SEQ bioregion, and this works for other species than glossies as well, doing a look at what information is out there for these threatened species. What is their feeding versus their breeding versus their other habitats that they use? Running local workshops to gain confidence on habitat use. So we could do a data trawl for glossies and then do an intersect of that and their feed tree records with regional ecosystem mapping in Queensland, because it's such a fantastic resource. And then you could run workshops to go, does this make sense? You know glossies in your area, do regional workshops, identify that, refine the rules, because glossies could well be using habitats in different ways across the state, and they certainly do across the country. How does that change? How do we get these locally, bioregionally, potentially relevant mapping introduced into state legislative processes? So we can do that. There's another 1,000 species in Queensland, and I'm sure then there's definitely more in other states as well. What do we do about those? In Queensland, we're fortunate. We've got a habitat mapping process that the state government has enabled that we can follow that. Otherwise, we are left with the buffered point, which doesn't do as much as it possibly could, as we could be doing for our threatened species. I mentioned before about the local government application, just in case there are local governments on board here, as matters of local environment significance can't be the same as the state environment significance. It can also use, and our local governments who've been partners in the Conservancy have been doing this, using the mapping to help target their private land conservation programs, their extension programs, support for land for wildlife, support for their covenant programs. They've been using it to identify areas for reserve acquisition and management, and also in how they manage those. So we've got large trees. Do we do raking around them? What fire regimes do we need? Because we've got casuarinas or allocasuarinas in there, which we have a very influenced by the relationship with fire, depending on how soon and how frequent the fire is, depending on how well your she oaks are regenerating in a landscape. We've used it for community awareness and citizen science programs, particularly things like our Great Glossy Count, so we can actually use it to go, well, this is potential habitat. Can we get people out there and confirm that it is being used? How does that change our knowledge of the landscapes? And also for potentially locations for offset delivery where it does not conflict or does not overlap with the substantial same element as matters of state environment significance. So I think that's all I was going to say to you guys today, which means we have plenty of time for some questions, I hope. We've got some links up there for looking at our habitat mapping. Just a heads up, that link to the SEQ habitat mapping on the Conservancy's webpage isn't actually active yet, but it's there so you can keep a check on it in the future. Once the mapping is done, it will be there. There's our info at glossyblack.org.au if you've got any questions that you haven't put in the chat that you want to follow up on. And I'd like to sort of thank Wires for their providing us with the funding so that we could undertake this project. I'd like to thank the Glossy Black Conservancy Research and Science Working Group, who have been pushing hard to make decisions about how we use and apply this data, the thousands of citizen scientists and their inspiring inspiration that they give to others. I know we have Spencer on here, but there's others in the chat or in this room who are doing a lot to talk to others about glossies and inspire them to collect information. And importantly, record it, tell someone about it, put it in those state government databases, put it into iNaturalist. I've taken lots of photos, well, not that many photos, but if I do find orts, taking a photo of an ort on the ground and putting it into iNaturalist means it's going to be picked up as a glossy record, right? The Queensland Government staff have been amazing in providing guidance and support with refining the rules and making sure we're following the new methods and aligning with that, as well as data access to confidential data that they've got access to. And yes, Shannon, you're a legend, as you know, who's worked with me on this one, so worked with us on this one. So we're still working on it. Really keen to hear your feedback. If there's things in the chat I need to talk about, Sam or Shannon, I'm going to stop talking now, but yeah, please jump in.
Thank you, Liz. There are a couple of questions in the chat, which I'll come to. Oops, hang on. Yes, you can hear me okay? Very good.
Okay.
Yes, a couple of questions in the chat, which I'll come to in a moment. We did get to the bottom of the red line on your screen, Liz. I'm not going to name names, but somehow the drawing capability for this webinar was activated, and one of our creative participants decided to have a go. So thank you for that and for owning up. I also don't know how to fix it, so it's there now. And another shout out to Wires for making this possible. Look, Wires are a really awesome organisation, also quite small, also reliant on people making donations and contributions to a whole heap of biodiversity projects. So obviously worth your support, and we're so just thrilled that we could undertake this work in partnership with Wires, and huge thanks to Liz and Shannon for doing all the hard yards, because again, the Conservancy says it's a Conservancy project, but the skill set to pull this together sits outside the Conservancy, even though Liz is very much a member of the Conservancy. And a shout out to some other Conservancy friends and friend adjacent people online. Marima from Tweed is here, Kim and Joel, Diane from the Lockyer, Lisa from Redlands back for her second webinar. Lisa, you might be able to do the hat trick if you come to the third one. Jed is online, and Laura Tan from BirdLife had joined us but has left, and shout out to Liz from the Scenic Rim as well. So a question from Vincent, how can we find a list of the best regional ecosystems to explore for populations, Liz?
Oh, to find glossies, Vincent, we will be putting that out with our habitat mapping. So that document that I shared back on the, I don't know, whatever screen it was, one of the first slides, we'll be providing that revised, what we call a taxon profile that will accompany our mapping. As soon as our experts have signed off on that, we will make that available, regardless of whether the mapping is approved or not. That profile will still stand as a document. So that will have that list of regional ecosystems that we know have either preferred or occasional feed tree species in them that glossies are likely to use. So that should be available to you by the end of the year. Just keep an eye on the if you sign up to the Conservancy's newsletter, well, no doubt we'll announce it in that, hey, Sam, and it'll be available to you. Our intent is to make as much information available publicly, because glossies need everybody. They need the whole community to be helping them in this space.
Thanks, Liz. And Shannon has also just popped a link in the chat, which is for the old list. So feel free to access that. Lovely comment from Kim and Joel. Such important work. Thank you, Liz, Shannon and Wires for pulling this together. Also, please, if you've got any other questions, drop them in the chat. And while we wait for that, a shout out, you mentioned, Liz, artificial nesting. And the fact that we don't know of any successful nesting using artificial structures on the mainland of Australia. So thanks to the National Recovery Team and the Conservancy Science and Research Group, we have just launched a survey i.e. once you mentioned it, I decided to launch it because it was ready. So I have popped the link for that survey in the chat. We will be in touch with more information, but in the meantime, if you or someone you know has been involved in trials or any installation of artificial nesting structures or hollows, please complete that because, as I said, nobody is aware of any successful nesting using artificial structures. Max has just shared some good news for glossies yesterday. The Queensland government announced that there will be no further logging of native forests on publicly owned state forests within the SEQ regional plan area. So thank you for that good news, Max. Happy to hear it. Hopefully it's enforced. And he's popped a map of the regional plan area in the chat too. Are there any other questions?
I can see one here. Not sure the first name, L. Battersby, just asking about acquisition of land by the Conservancy to protect it in lieu of future property. Look, the Conservancy is not in a position to actually acquire land, but we know people who do who do buy land for conservation purposes. Love to hear more about that. I know exactly where Barellan Point is. You're just up the road from where I am. So maybe if you could flick us an email to info@glossyblack.org.au with a little bit more details, and maybe we can help you offline.
Thank you. Thanks, Liz, and thanks, L. Battersby. There was also another comment, NS1, as a consultant, I'm involved in a project where glossy habitat will be cleared. The client has been responsive to reducing this area as much as possible. Seeing as there is no record of use of artificial nest boxes, do you have any recommendation for mitigation measures? Any records of use of relocated natural hollows?
Yeah, well, no. Sorry, no. I'm trying to push that really hard whenever we get inquiries from the states who do that kind of assessment thing, is we don't have any means of mitigating loss of potential hollows for glossies. The answer is no on the mainland. So until there's a means of doing it, I would just encourage you to push as hard as you can for that. If you don't, again, if you're not sure that glossies are using it, nest boxes will help lots of other species, right? So they definitely will help other species. We just don't know that that's going to help glossies. I don't have a better answer for you. Sorry.
Thanks, Liz. And Kate's also great question and good memory, Kate. At the National Forum last year, Liz, we had a couple of presentations that talked about soil type and geology and including those in habitat mapping. Do you recommend including soil type and geology in mapping?
Look, no, not for Southeast Queensland. So we had some discussion with Tim Ryan at the Queensland Herbarium, and I don't know if those of you who know Tim Ryan, absolute legend of regional ecosystem mapping and understanding geologies across Southeast Queensland. I asked him that question that came out of the National Forum, and he said, it's certainly looking at the regional ecosystems in Southeast Queensland, he would say, well, there is an association of those, I can look up the exact details, the non-calcareous sediments, but pretty much it's everywhere in Southeast Queensland. It doesn't actually help us refine our mapping at all. There is an association, but that's because glossies are found on so many land types that have that association. So it may exist, but it doesn't help us refine glossy habitat in terms of foraging habitat at all. So I do have the technical wording for that. If you need that, again, flick that across to info@Glossy Black, and we can give you the finer details on that one.
Thanks, Liz. And Shannon's just added to that to let people know that we only have 40 recorded nest trees across the SEQ bioregion, and all old growth trees with hollows are critical for glossies and all hollow-bearing fauna. Thanks, Shannon. Are there any other questions or discussion topics you'd like to flag? Yes, Vincent says he has the field guide to the southeastern Glossy Black-Cockatoo for the last Great Glossy Count, which is in 2023. Will these be made available again in the future? Vincent, happy to let you know that thanks to a few different grants here and there, we have been able to reprint the field guides. If anybody would like a copy, look, they actually cost heaps to mail out. So if people would like a copy, it's very convenient for us if someone would like to take 20 of them and be a distribution point rather than mailing them out one at a time. But please use that info at Glossy Black email address, and we will pop some in the post. Also, I have to physically address each envelope and make it to the post office, and that's usually a major life admin barrier. So please send us a request. We absolutely have them, and they're for you. They're for people in the field. So send us a request and we will pop them in the post to you, Vincent. And if you've got other citizen scientists working with you, Vincent, more than happy to send you a pile of them. Thanks, Belinda. Thank you for joining us. While I just wait a few moments for other questions, just a reminder that this session has been recorded, so we will just tidy that up a little bit and send a link out to everybody that was registered. So we actually had 138 people registered. So again, thank you to Wires for funding this. We were able to, get the word out to a large group of people and let them know that it would be recorded. So that link will just go to those 138 people, but of course you're welcome to share it. We have field guides, so please drop us a line if you would like one. We have the Great Glossy Count coming up in May next year, and I've just popped the link for that artificial nesting survey in the chat. Shannon's also added another note for Kate. The Queensland Regional Ecosystem Mapping takes into account land zones, which considers surrogates for geology, and our soil and geology mapping is not consistent across the state and nation. Why would it be? Details. Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much for coming. A huge thank you to Liz and Shannon for having the passion and drive to really bring this project to life with the modest resources that were available. Having taken carriage of this with their previous employer and then to be able to continue to work on it was just an absolute score for the Glossy Black Conservancy to have the same team work on that. We're really thrilled to be able to share the rules and all the other bits and pieces that fed into the mapping process with all of you and with a larger audience as well. And of course, any outcomes we achieve for Glossy Black-Cockatoos are outcomes for a huge number of other species. There is also a national recovery plan being drafted at the moment. A couple of members of the recovery team were online today, so please stay tuned for that information. And we really value your support at the Conservancy. So thank you, Liz. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Wires. Thank all of you who contributed data, which feeds into the mapping process if you ever wondered what happened to your sightings data. And if you have any questions, drop us a line. We'll be happy to answer them. Anything to wrap up, Liz?
No, just ditto to all of that. Without a citizen scientist telling us about glossies, the passionate people caring out there, and everyone who's joined online, everybody has a role to play for glossies. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you all. See you next time.